Welcome to the fourth in this season of Overheard Conversations. I wanted to start by just saying thank you to all of the paid subscribers to Writing Home who are making it possible to do this. So thank you, all of you, for your support. It's an amazing thing to be able to put time into convening conversations in this way. I know that quite a few of you who are with us on the call are already signed up for the Further Adventures in Regrowing a Living Culture series. There's a lovely note that I saw go past on Substack from Adam Wilson from the Peasantry School, who was part of one of our earlier online series. And Adam wrote, "The true cost of admission. You might suddenly find yourself tangled in the weave of stories, people, ideas, and actions so compelling that becoming untangled loses all appeal. So you have been warned, should you nonetheless feel like signing up for that series, which starts on the 23rd and 24th of May. But here we are tonight, and for the next 40 minutes or so, it's going to be just me and Jay. So I've put the egg timer on. Hello, Jay.
Hello, Dougal. How are you?
I'm all right, thanks. Yeah, not bad. It's been flurries of snow here today. I've just spent the last 20 minutes loading the summer tires into the back of the car so that Anna can take the car and have them changed tomorrow, which feels like an act of faith given the weather. But yeah, here we are. And we've got some time together to have one of our conversations. Uh,
With an audience.
yeah, apparently there are some people listening in. We'll see.
Yeah, I wonder how chaotic it's going to be compared to our normal chats.
Well, I was going to start off. I mean, obviously, I can introduce you by saying that you're sort of among the people who was around the beginnings of solar punk, and that's one of the things we're going to roll into in the conversation. But there's this question that I've been asking everyone who's taken part in one of these, which is, tell me more about where you call home.
I have always had an easy answer to that question, and home is wherever a door opens if you knock. And yeah, I've always thought that that was the answer because it doesn't necessarily have to be the place in where I live. It's the place in which I am welcome. And that also means that you have a relationship with the welcomer and whether you know but I am from the Isle of Thanet in the most southeasterly corner of England. Grew up on the Chalk, the North Sea and the Channel, and then I guess since then South London has been my home since 2003.
So uh, that adds something to why I'm not even sure when exactly we first crossed paths, because it means that we were both knocking around in South London in those years around the beginning of Dark Mountain and so much else that was um, going on. But I mean, we must have met in those very early years of Dark Mountain, which puts it around the point where solar punk was kind of brewing as
Yeah,
an idea.
I think it was just after Really Free School or one of those anarchist teaching um, sites in the student protests that we met the first time.
That makes
Um,
sense. So
yeah,
that dates it to when it was kicking off everywhere.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I'd already kicked off and decided that after the climate camp at the G8, I was no longer going to be getting pushed around by cops. I was done with that particular, which was a couple of years before.
Right. Yeah. I have a really strong memory of climate camp. So was it that year when it was at Blackheath on?
No, that was outside the it was outside the exchange.
Okay.
at the G8 protest.
Ah, right. So the one I'm remembering is when it was on Blackheath,
Yeah, I remember that.
Southeast London, and I was there with Lottie Child and a few other people, and we were dancing in a tent that had a solar powered sound system, and it was the middle of, well, it wasn't quite the middle of the night, but it was already dark, and the battery that had been charging up during the day died on this sound system, and there's about 30 of us in this tent, and everyone's kind of milling around. And then this sort of impromptu a cappella thing starts up where someone just starts singing a song, and everyone joins in, and it goes
Yeah,
around. And at some point, this something starts up which I totally don't recognize, and then gradually realize someone must have explained it to me because I was too old to get it. It was the Pokemon theme tune.
really. That's amazing. Which incidentally is why I'm called the JMO, because I was really
Really?
into Pokemon when I was a kid. Well, as a teenager, so I was called JMO.
See, this dates us because I'm too old to have known what Pokemon was when this event happened. But I remember having this moment of vision of just imagining that we're 200 years in the future, and that sort of all of the cultural detritus of late consumer capitalism has kind of decayed like leaf mold into what everything becomes if it stays around long enough, which is oral culture, and that the Pokemon theme tune is just one more thing within the mix of this, which actually feels, is that a Dark Mountain or a solar punk thought, or is it maybe in the border zone between the two?
I think it's in between the two, but I do really like the idea that in the future, the folk song of our era is "I want to be the best, the very best there ever was."
There was a guy around, I don't know where he got to, around Dark Mountain in those very beginnings, who had a five-piece jazz group that would do um, these improvisations. And the one I remember was the Nokia tune,
Yeah,
mobile
sure.
phone rings.
Yeah, that's very cool.
The
Well,
solar
birds
pop.
sing it now, don't they?
Do they?
Yeah.
That sounds quite dystopian. So I want to maybe get you to sort of take me back to basics with solar punk, and what it meant to you in those beginnings. That what was
Hmm.
it that was coming alive around
Yep.
that?
I guess to really rewind the clock, when I first became aware of the environment was as a kid, and it was the Brer oil disaster, which I think was 1992. Someone will correct me, but I think it's 92, 93. I was in year 3 at school, and it was around the same time that CFCs had just been banned and the hole in the ozone layer was being addressed. And Captain Planet was on TV, which we can come back to around like solar punk storylines. Um, but and we were being taught about climate change, right, in the 90s. And it was like, oh, well, we mobilized, like in Britain, we mobilized in Scotland and sorted out Brer very quickly. CFCs are ticked off the list. Next is going to be forest deforestation and so on and so forth. And it's like we're in the long peace, end of the Cold War, just like growing up, ambiently. I'm like, 7 or 8, but then nothing happened.
Hmm.
And then was a climate change activist, and then nothing was happening. And Dark Mountain happened, and it was just that reframing around like we should face the future with eyes wide open is one of the things that I really got out of Dark Mountain, in terms of like that kind of not post climate activism, but just the idea that there is going to be a future regardless of what happens, and that we need to face it with open eyes. And I think around that same time in the early 2010s, was also the long thread of discussion around the rescue mission and the salvage mission that happened across all sorts of various pockets of interesting people. So that dichotomy, which one do you choose, or do you do both? You know, and I think I came through or out of the other side of, you know, the Dark Mountain, not process, but, you know, engaging with the material about there is going to be some kind of future. What's the line in the manifesto about
It's, yeah, the
the
end
end
of
of
the
the,
world as we know it is not the end of the world, full stop. Together we will look for the hope beyond hope, the paths that lead into the unknown world that lies ahead.
yes. And I guess there was some vague part of me that was more interested in that unknown world, having always been a sci-fi fan, you know, and what does the future look like? And I was also, having gone through the grieving process of Dark Mountain, I just refused to be a doomer. Like, we're going to have to make the most of it. Like, regardless of what happens, like in the moment when we're going to have to make the most of it. And then what happened was, on a mailing list that I was on, um, remember those? Uh, Shout out to the Institute of Atemporal Studies and its members. Adam Flynn posted the word. He just posted. I can't even remember where it was, but he just, in the post that he posted to the mailing list, it said the word solar punk, and it was like a bolt of lightning, where I instantly knew. This was in 2012. I instantly knew what solar punk was, what it meant to me, what the possibilities were, the existence of cyberpunk, or presupposes the existence of solar punk. We'd seen the influence that steampunk had had on culture, in addition to cyberpunk kind of becoming, I mean, people joke about it now as being a roadmap rather than a rather than a warning. And just the influence that cultural projects had had on society, from not just cyberpunk, but, you know, Star Trek and so on and so forth. But just the two word, just solar punk, you know, as a term, I immediately knew what it was, or what it should be, or what it could be, or what it could become, if right back then. And then Adam Flynn posted the a couple of like the initial proposition, and it was about energy transition, ecology, and cyberpunk was just like the, you know, the original. Maybe it was bicycles as well. I think I can't remember exactly what it is. It's the very first thing ever posted to solarpunks.net. But then within a month, he had posted the essay on the need for new futures, which still is one of the best essays to read about solarpunk. And, you know, regardless of how big and how crazy it's become in the last 14 years, that's the essay that everyone should go read, because it's well worth it. And then just to fast forward, I got involved in 24. I joined the Tumblr as an admin in 2014, and I've been posting there ever since.
Right. That's really helpful just in terms of getting our bearings. And I'm thinking back to that sort of moment for me that, you know, the beginnings of my conversation with Paul, you know, and he already had an idea for something called Dark Mountain, and we were basically comparing notes to see if what we were seeing and what we were wanting to do had enough overlap that, you know, we could work on this together. And one of the things that was kind of creating, I guess, the field within which I was looking at everything, and this would have been 2007, 2008, was John Michael Greer.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, if we the last of these sessions, I was talking to Rob Lewis, whose words were on the very first page of the first Dark Mountain book. The first essay that sort of opened that book after the contents section was one from John Michael Greer. And one of the things that he had been kind of bashing everybody over the head with on all sides was, you know, this culture likes to imagine progress as some kind of grand trajectory to the stars, and it likes to imagine collapse as some kind of, it's all going to be over really soon, opposite to that. But what it has a hard time holding its attention to is the idea of a future that isn't going to look like either of those things. And so, trying to take this out into the public sphere at the point where we were writing the manifesto, it was very hard for it to be heard other than as, doom, collapse, etc. But those lines that you've already referenced are part of what was the frame for me, which is we have to clear out the way all of this sort of nonsense of imagining that there's this thing called climate change, which is a problem that can be fixed and made to go away, and the future can look like some kind of extension of the recent past, in order to have a space where we can get real about it. But the other bit that's striking me as we're talking, and not least hearing your experience of the, passing through the field of Dark Mountain in those early years, is although we talked a lot about stories in the manifesto, I don't think Dark Mountain was ever actually meant to be a story generating engine. I think that Dark Mountain, well, as Charlotte Ducan said very perceptively after her first encounter with it, she was very involved in transition at that time. And she said, if transition is the village, Dark Mountain is the shaman that lives on the edge of the village. It's liminal. And part of the point about the liminal is that it is in between stories. And so a lot of my role in the early years at the festivals would be this kind of surge of energy that people had. Often people who, like you, like me, had been involved in climate activism in those years immediately before, and reached a point of kind of no longer believing in some of the things that we'd been saying, or no longer wanting to put ourselves on the line in the ways that we had been doing, needed an in-between space where there wasn't a rush to new explanations, new answers, new projects, but people would get, restored by 2 days in that space. And then on the Sunday morning, someone would convene a session where they'd go, so what are we going to do? And I realized kind of intuitively that there was no we here that could do. The nature of the liminal space is not that. You've stepped back from the kind of agency in which narratives and the linearity of narratives makes sense. And you have to then find your way back to that. And you don't get to find that your way back to that together with everyone who you were sat around the campfire with in that liminal setting. You have to see who's with you, which of the conversations that happened that weekend still make sense when you get back. But that, solar punk is much more of a narrative field than Dark Mountain ever actually has been.
I am just going to look up, bear with me 1 second. Adam Flynn wrote Solarpunk Notes Towards the Manifesto, which was part of the ASU's Hieroglyph project, which was downstream of oh, I forget his name now. Who wrote Snow Crash?
Oh, yeah.
The chat would tell me. This is embarrassing. It's been a long day.
It's not Bruce Sterling. It's
embarrassing, isn't it?
We'll stick it in the show notes. Yeah.
Neil Stevenson. And he says that hieroglyphs act as like cultural, they're kind of like cultural mega projects. So like the idea of a space elevator is one of them, or a moon mission before we'd gone to the moon was another one. And the hieroglyph project asked for open essays. And one of them was Adam's Solarpunk Notes Towards a Manifesto. And you will notice actually that set the precedent, because all of the manifestos, so-called, that have been published by solarpunks, plural, have always said a manifesto rather than the manifesto, which has always been, I think quite a nice, there's no claim to being, like any one truth. But the reason why I am speaking about this is because he basically says setting, is that the right word? He basically in that essay, he talks about solarpunk could be a flag for people to rally around. It could be a setting for tabletop RPGs. It could be a narrative mechanism for talking about what the future might look like. And it still exists as those things. It could be any of these things, you know, as a term.
Mm.
And just to pick up on kind of the next leap of logic, if cyberpunk, when it was originally conceived and written, was people detecting the rapid pace of Moore's law and transistors and the integrated circuit becoming everywhere, because that was what cyberpunk really was about, right? Imagining this world where everyone has computers and they're everywhere. Then solarpunk is also about a semiconductor technology, and that is solar panels.
Mm-hmm.
And that begins in 2012. And you just have to look at the falling cost of solar panels since then in the last 14 years to kind of think of it as that's its relationship to technology as it mirrors cyberpunk. And what's very crazy for me is that some of the best early solarpunk stories were set in the near future, and we're now in the future that those stories were written, and we are already experiencing, you know, crazy floods in Dubai, forest fire, smell the Canadian forest fires in London, etc. You know, we're living in the near future it was meant to envision.
Yes, and I mean there there's something here as well, you know, when you're referring to early solar punk stuff that was set around now that was envisioning something like the kind of near future that has become our near present.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, that's a different key to some of what is maybe at least aesthetically associated with solar punk, which is a sort of strong emphasis on the upbeat, on optimism and utopias. And oh, I guess that's one of the questions that I have really is, oh, how far is the how far is the picture of solar punk as being a kind of solar powered rescue of the world as we knew it, and hyper urbanism with lots more trees and plants on
Mm-hmm.
buildings. Is that a fair depiction of it? What's the relationship between that and your experience from being in the middle of the whole solar punk thing?
Well, this is one of the key things about being inside. I mean, if anyone is familiar with how fandom works as well, is that when you're in the middle of it, things are extremely nuanced and have various roots. And whereas when you're looking in from the outside, the thing that you're going to see is the things that have the highest velocity at the edge. You know, so when you Google solar punk, you're going to get eco brutalist cities with trees because that's the thing that is highest registered in Google Images, and therefore that gets reproduced endlessly. If that, you know what I mean?
Yes.
But 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 if you click on a solarpunk hashtag on Tumblr or go through the Reddit, what you get is lean-to greenhouses with new semiconductor technologies, permaculture, uh, community food growing, building techniques, blah blah blah. You know what I mean? So you get all of this juxtaposition of ideas, and which is incredibly like generative, you know, and like that's almost the point of solar punk, is that it's this bringing together of things that already exist, looking laterally, bringing them together, and then projecting them forward. And as Paul Graham Raven says, the future is a place in which you can test your ideas
Mm-hmm.
to destruction with no consequence. So the more futures you generate, the more ideas we can have about them, and we can see what works collectively.
So I was wondering what um what I was kind of sensing coming when I wrote At Work in the Ruins and became a lot clearer last year is a kind of parting of the ways between people who would have been kind of allies in disagreement, and now it's much clearer that there's been a fort.
Hmm.
And George Monbiot and Chris Smage would be the sort of the names if you wanted to pin this down really clearly, because over the last 2 years, on the one hand, George wrote his Regenesis book, and then Chris wrote Saying No to a Farm-Free Future, which was
Hmm.
a critique of Regenesis. And then George, rather than responding to the substance of the critique, wrote what was essentially a hatchet job on Chris, who has far less platform than George does. I don't want to go down the whole of sort of relitigating that, but I did say to Paul Kingsnorth last year that, I remember George coming to the 10th anniversary of Dark Mountain Party in Oxford in 2019. And I said, I think whenever the next time there's something like that, I can't imagine him coming.
Mm.
The distance has widened between those who are looking for the Hail Mary pass on high tech, the world as we've known it, whether it's through, vat grown foods or whatever it is, but all of which sort of rests on one story
Yeah.
about solar and renewable, which is that it can somehow provide abundant energy that is going to allow us to take fossil fueled industrial society to the next level and fix climate change and the rest of it, versus those of us who are saying, no, it's not that these technologies are useless and aren't going to play a part in the future, but we need to get real about the likelihood of a future that doesn't involve the kind of abundance of energy that we've been taking for granted during the last handful of generations, but that doesn't have to be awful as a
Hmm.
consequence either. And I'm just curious to know from your perspective, as you say, in the middle, in the nuance of solar punk, whether you see that same pattern playing out within your world, or how that plays into the kind of the future
Yeah,
solar
I
punks.
would I would probably say that there, if you want to make a distinction, there's probably like a high and low solar punk kind
Mm,
of, if you want to, break the genre. And I would say that high solar punk is set in a future where climate change has been fixed, or at least we're through the worst of it.
mhm.
And people like to imagine those shining futures. And then low solar punk, which is the solar punk that I identify the most with, is en route. It's people. I wouldn't say they're not dystopian stories, but there are people living through incredible hardships and making the most of it and having relationships and finding love, and you know what I mean? Like, and doing all the, and I use this term a lot as a catch-all when I'm teaching students, but I like the term do the things that need doing. Like, so if we do all the things that need doing, because the list is too long to talk about them all. Um, but I would say that that's kind of the distinction there between the two. But I would also say that from my experience speaking to people who are solarpunk authors or involved in solarpunk inspired projects, no one thinks the standard of living is going to be the same.
Mhm.
It's not to say that everyone signs up to kind of the degrowth model, and that's exactly how it's going to go. But um, no one, absolutely no one thinks that, even you can even tell solar punk stories that even if everyone does have a solar panel on the roof, it means what are we going to do at night if we don't have batteries? You know what I mean? Like, how does culture change if we do all have solar panels, even if we do, what are we going to do at night when we don't have as much energy storage, for example? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yes, and I'm struck by, this is another version of the thing that you were quoting from Paul Graham Raven about, the multiplication of futures, is that the thing that I was sort of describing kind of as a politicized split, if you like, within the context of a lot of the conversations I'm part of, you've just kind of remapped as a kind of near and far future
But they're
um,
also just two
within,
futures,
yeah.
you know, like that, the dialectic, or like the opposition that's happening between Chris and George's work are just two visions of the future. And I mean, I really like Madeline Ashby, who's a sci-fi author. She has a quote that says, everyone should speak loudly and clearly and in detail about the future that they want, because you don't get what you don't share.
Mm.
So the more visions of the future that you produce, the more perhaps in line with one another, where do we agree? Where do we disagree? Where do we, what can we all agree upon, about the futures that we want to inhabit or have.
As you're talking about that, I'm realizing one of the places where this does kind of uh, rub up against something that I've said in various contexts over the years that I'd be interested to just bounce off you here is I've often spoken for a skepticism about the usefulness of futures talk. I wrote a thing a while back, which was about having become an accidental futurist and realizing that I didn't I didn't believe in the future. And what I meant by that was that anything that we say about the future is a projection that we're sort of throwing up
Mm-hmm.
effectively on a blank screen. And that projection is being made from here and from now, from a particular position within this particular set of times of the present. And it's shaped by all of the assumptions that I and the people around me just now are making. And nothing that we say about the future can ever bring to our attention the assumptions that we don't even know we're making, the ones that we're taking for just how things are. And this is the sense of Illich's phrase of the mirror of the past.
Mm-hmm.
Looking into the mirror of the past, paying attention to the strangeness of what the people there are taking for granted, to use an atemporal way of speaking. And in the strangeness and internal coherence of that, becoming aware of the strangeness I don't even notice about what me and those around me are taking for granted. So I'm just curious, given that you've been talking about the power of what we can do
Yeah.
with futures. Does the past come up very much, or does that kind of critique of the limits of futures thinking, is that something that you've heard
Yeah.
in?
Well, at least in my circles,
Mm,
definitely. People that think a lot about the future and what the future means to culture. But I mean, I'm just coming first of all to what to one point in the On the Need for New Futures essay from 2012. Adam quotes Bruce Sterling's atemporality for the artist, and his talk that he gave, or his long essay that he wrote. But I'm also thinking about um, two things. One, that solar punk is very much inspired by looking laterally at what's already in the world or things that have been overlooked. I read a whole bunch of books about Victorian glass houses over the pandemic, and like just I can't believe they all went away. It's unbelievable. We knew about passive solar heating and cooling and so on and so forth, like but the gas boiler came along.
yeah.
um, but yeah, it's also about things that have been overlooked, and whether that's through colonialism or other forms of biases. That's one of the things that I mean, I would say that also, having spoken to like Afrofuturists and various people involved in futures thinking and sci-fi around the world, is like solar punk is very much in dialogue with all of those other futures, Sino futures, or the Gulf futurists are really interesting, post petro state. Um, but there's also a little bit of me that wants to respond about thinking about the way that you're talking about the future. Is like Raymond Williams. Basically, I mean, I'm going to paraphrase him, but he basically talks about that the world right now, for all its problems, is always fostering another very different world, and that if you put an S on of those at the end of that world, it's all of those worlds are possible worlds, and we have to choose which ones we want to go towards. And perhaps this comes to your taking the little path point in your book, that if you want to live somewhere, if you look out your window and you know about solar punk or have been exposed to any of the ideas that it's a container for, a useful container for people who are working in this space, then if you pull up at Tesco's and there's the scrubland next to it and you ask yourself, why isn't this a food forest? And that's immediately a little future.
Yes, I can see that. And there's a tuning of the attention there that makes you look at spaces differently, which I can definitely relate to. And I mean, I think you partly answered my question about the role of the past, because you've been talking before about solar punk in relation to cyberpunk,
Mm-hmm.
but also solar punk in relation to steampunk,
Yeah.
which, once you're talking about the Victorian glass houses and so on, the kind of the possible futures derived from possible pasts,
Mm-hmm.
or other trajectories. And that, now I can, this is where I can sort of give back something from Illich, having kind of used Illich as a reference point for a critique, which is the activating of apparently abandoned trajectories within the past is actually really central to the kind of the historical work that
Yep.
Illich is doing. He's always looking for those dropped threads that that don't look significant because they weren't followed through, but which, if one picks them up and follows through on them, instead of a curious dropped thread, however many centuries back, can actually then become a kind of a constellation by which people were steering by later. This sense that the meaning of the past can be changed by our actions in the present, and that's part of how futures come about.
Well, this is Carrie Face's point with her thick present thesis, right?
Yeah.
Is that a thick present is the present transformed by reinterpreting the past and then projecting it forwards. And
Yes.
that, engagement with solar punk is also like in some ways is the generation of a thick present, in order to think about the future in new ways.
Well, we've been talking about time and atemporality, and sort of appropriately enough, my egg timer has moved into like a different tempo to all of the other clocks that we might be running on. So we are coming up to 40 minutes. Before we start to kind of take questions from people and say farewell to those who are watching the free version on YouTube, is there anything else that you want to just drop into this moment in the conversation, Jay?
Yes, the last thing I would say is that if people are interested in solar punk just as a general idea, I think it's very illustrative that solar punk has been released as short stories and in anthologies rather than having the defining novel, the same way that that cyberpunk was kind of created with Neuromancer, because the anthologies are all collections of voices, each with their own futures. And I just think, and the anthology is something that's becoming more and more popular in I think there's about 14 of them right now in English. If you want to go think about how many voices that is, 140 voices or whatever.
I think there's a place to land on in terms of the common ground between the ways that we've both been involved in working. Because yes, I mean the 25th Dark Mountain anthology came out last week, and there is something. I've probably quoted this in one of the earlier conversations in this series. I remember Martin Shaw saying to me, there's something very generous about the way you went about doing things with Dark Mountain, because what you did was to build a platform where someone could stumble across it, get excited about it. 6 months later, their name is there alongside the names of the people who founded it in the next anthology. And in the same way, but the difference is that all of those anthologies have been published by a single entity called Dark Mountain, just as we had a single The Dark Mountain Manifesto. And I can say, just at the level of personal sanity, that there can be drawbacks to that approach for those at the heart of it. So I salute the way that you and everyone else who's been involved in different ways have managed to bring something that has some coherence and diffusion into the world under the name of solar punk over these
I mean, it
last.
certainly annoys a lot of people. There is people do like everything pinned like a butterfly on a corkboard, and that's not how you go about doing things.
No, no. And anyway, any manifesto, any written text is just the best that whoever was involved could do at that moment in time. And turning it into something definitive and authoritative is unwise, I would venture to
I
say.
agree.
So at this moment, then, we're going to say farewell to those who are watching the free recording of the session. And I'm going to unpin you and me, Jay, and we're going to start taking questions.